Hello and welcome back to Fun with History. In this video we will study the Russian revolutions. I have divided this unit into 6 points. In the first one we will study the revolution of 1905. In the second one, the revolution of February of the year 1917. The third one is about the revolution of October. Then the Civil War. Point number 5 is the creation of the Soviet Union, and point number 6, the totalitarian leaders of the Soviet Union, is divided into 2 different points: what happened with Lenin and what happened with Stalin. And now, without further delay, let's start with the first point. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was an absolute monarchy ruled by Tsar Nicholas II. The base of the economy was agriculture, but they had out-of-date agricultural techniques. However, remember that Russia was one of the latecomers and the number of industrial workers increased, but they lived in really bad conditions. In January of the year 1905, a huge number of people marched on the Tsar's palace, asking for better living conditions. The Tsar's soldiers fired on them, killing hundreds of people. This led to several strikes throughout the whole country. Probably the most famous one is the mutiny of the battleship Potemkin. At the same time, the prestige of the empire was damaged due to the humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War. These events forced the Tsar to establish a parliament called Duma with limited power. Meanwhile, the workers and soldiers formed Soviets. A Soviet is a committee of workers, peasants, and soldiers that represent them. Despite the revolution, the Tsar continued ruling as an authoritarian monarch. During the World War I, Russia faced another crisis. About 1.7 million people died, and there weren't enough peasants working in the countryside because they were fighting in the war. This led to food shortages. In 1917, there were food riots in the capital city, Petrograd, nowadays St. Petersburg. And the Tsar ordered the soldiers to fire on the rioters. Instead of doing that, most of the soldiers joined the rioters. Nicholas then abdicated, and the Duma formed a provisional government that included liberals and socialists. It introduced some reforms and promised to hold democratic elections for a constituent assembly. However, the provisional government soon became unpopular because it couldn't end the war or prevent the food shortages. They had to share the power with the Petrograd Soviet. That made it more difficult because they encouraged workers to go on strike and to disobey the government. The Bolsheviks, a group of the SDLP, the Social Democratic Labour Party, a Marxist party created in 1898, believed that a small number of revolutionaries should lead a revolution to establish a socialist government. His leader was Lenin, and they had a military force called Red Guard, consisted of soldiers as well as factory workers led by Leon Trotsky. During the World War I, Lenin was on exile in Switzerland, but after the revolutions of February, he came back to Russia. Lenin increased the support for the Bolsheviks using the slogan "Peace, Bread and Land." He promised the end of the war and promised to give land to the peasants and the control of the factories to the industrial workers. In October of the year 1917, the Red Guards took control of Petrograd, including the headquarters of the provisional government. The Bolsheviks carried out elections for the new Constituent Assembly, but they only won a small share of the votes. Their answer to that disappointment was to dissolve the assembly and ban the other political parties. They renamed the country as the Russian Soviet Republic and called themselves the Russian Communist Party. They also ended Russia's involvement in the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed the 3rd of March of the year 1918 with the Central Powers that were Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. With this treaty, Russia ceded to Germany the Baltic states and recognized the independence of Ukraine. Russians who opposed the Bolsheviks formed the White Armies to fight against them. This led to a civil war. The Red Russians held the Tsar and his family as prisoners and executed them in the year 1918. The World War I allies helped the Whites because they were afraid of the spread of communism throughout Europe, but also because they wanted Russia to rejoin the war against Germany. However, the Reds controlled Petrograd and most of the industrial areas and the railways. They were more organized and more motivated, and they finally won the war after fighting 3 years in 1921. After World War I, communists fought for controlling again the territories that Russia had lost in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states gained independence under the anti-communist governments, and Belarus and Ukraine became communist states, and together with the Russian Soviet Republic formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. The Soviet Union was controlled by the Communist Party and controlled by Russia. The new Soviet Union was controlled by totalitarian leaders. The first one was Lenin, who, after winning the war, introduced the NEP, or New Economic Policy, to recover the economy after that devastating war. The government continued to own large businesses, including the banks, but private individuals were allowed to own small businesses. Peasants were allowed to sell their surplus, and they had to pay, in exchange, they had to pay more taxes. The NEP increased the agricultural production and reduced the food shortages. Apart from the NEP, there were many other reforms. Religion was banned and divorce became legal. An 8-hour working day was introduced, as well as the unemployment pay and the pensions. Women were encouraged to join the workforce. For example, history and Latin were banned and nobody studied them at schools, but everyone learned how to read or write. There were no political freedom, and the TEKA, a secret policy, arrested, tortured, and killed anybody who was suspected of opposing Lenin or the party. In 1924, Lenin died, leading to a struggle for power between Stalin, the general secretary of the party, and Trotsky, the leader of the Red Army. Stalin used his position to eliminate his opponents, became the party leader and a totalitarian leader. The Soviet propaganda portrayed Stalin as the loving and strong father of the nation. In 1928, Trotsky was exiled to Kazakhstan and finally was assassinated in 1940 in Mexico. Newspapers thanked Stalin for everything, from good harvests to the victories in wars. However, people feared him as much as they loved him. They knew that anybody suspected of disloyalty would be executed or sent to prison camps called gulags. Stalin ruled since 1924 to 1953, when he died, and was succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Between 1928 and 1938, he introduced a 5-year plan to increase the industrial production. Huge collective farms were supposed to make agriculture more efficient, and new towns and industries were built from nothing. The production of coal, iron, oil, and electricity increased. However, there was a high human cost. The collectivism of agriculture led to famines and killed millions of people. People were imprisoned or executed sometimes just because they worked too slowly. Thousands died from accidents, starvation, or cold. And that's all. We will continue studying the Soviet Union when we study the Cold War. And see you in the next video. Remember that you have to watch it more than one time, and you have to complete your tiki-toki timelines and take your corner notes. See you!